Hello students, today we will read the next chapter, Tippitty the Flying Squirrel. So listen to the story carefully.
To know Tippitty was to love her, and I had known her for very long. Tippitty, I must tell you, was not a naughty little girl with a penchant for climbing up curtain poles, but a little rodent, commonly called a flying squirrel, the large red flying squirrel, and must on no account be mistaken for the flying fox, which has nothing to do with Tippitty's family. She was brought to me when only a few days old, and grew into a splendid specimen in all the glory of her wonderful chestnut red coat and 2 feet of bushy tail. She knew she was fascinating even at an early age, and nothing delighted her more than to show off her lovely tail. Her one drawback as a pet was that she was nocturnal, and so was most lively when it was time for ordinary people to be in bed. She lived in a little box with 2 partitions. The inner one, her bedroom, was fitted with a little nest of feathers and cotton wool, and a tiny door led from it into the bigger sitting room, where she also dined. The door of her sitting room being usually open, Tippitty would announce the fact that she was awake by giving a low growl and issuing from there in a succession of long and not very graceful jumps. She would make her way to the nearest table and there indulge in a tremendous stretch, extending her forelegs to the full in front of her and her hind legs as far as they could go behind her. Her head would first rest on the right forefoot, then on the left, her tail making circles in the air in the meantime. After her stretch would come her toilet, about which she was most particular. Tippitty would sit erect and carefully get to work with both her little hands. Beginning with the tip of her nose, she would gradually work over the whole of her face and head. The tail would be her last, but by no means her least care. Her toilet finished, Tippitty would have a look around, take one jump off the table, and race up the nearest curtains to the pole above. There she would sit, her tail coiled around her neck, and those great big black eyes of hers looking solemnly down. And sooner or later, she would leap right across the room onto my shoulder. Don, a field spaniel, and Brock, a large, shaggy Tibetan sheepdog, were Tippitty's best friends. Brock's great bushy tail afforded Tippitty much amusement as well as shelter in time of danger, for Tippitty knew friend from foe, and the approach of a stranger was the signal for her to make use of Brock's tail as a hiding place. Her behavior was not always that of a well-brought-up young lady, and truth obliges me to admit that during meals it was advisable to keep her tied at one end of the table. I have already said that she had a lovely tail, but its beauty was sometimes marred after passing through the soup, and so was the taste of the soup. Her own dinner consisted of milk and occasionally custard. Puddings she loved as much as any schoolboy, and stewed fruit kept her happy all evening. The hardest hill walnut was child's play to her sharp teeth. It took her about 10 minutes to make a hole in the nut, and then her long teeth and tongue would soon fetch out most of the kernel. Tippitty was the means of my solving a problem in natural history regarding which a controversy raged for many months. The Himalayan nutcracker, or Nucifraga hemispilla, had been credited with the holes one frequently found in walnuts in the Himalayas. I tested the truth of the assertion by placing walnuts under a tree where a pair of nutcrackers used to come. The birds turned over the nuts but did not attempt to break them. After this, a few nuts were collected in which Tippitty had already made holes and placed under the same tree and carefully watched. In due course, the birds came along and at once selected the bored walnuts and began pecking at them and working their beaks inside the holes. Flying squirrels are said to lap their drink, but Tippitty was much too ladylike to make any such fuss over her milk. She was usually in rather a hurry for it, and consequently more of her face went into the saucer than was intended by nature, with the result that a certain amount of liquid went up her nose and made Tippitty sneeze and splutter. Sometimes several attempts were made before she really settled down to have a good drink. But when she did, she got her lips well into the milk and no attempt was made to lap. She frequently accompanied me and the dogs on an afternoon stroll after being ruthlessly pulled out of her box. For the first 100 yards or so, she was perfectly happy jumping along behind. A flying squirrel's natural mode of progression when on the ground is a succession of jumps. Not the graceful little hop of the striped squirrel, but rather a lumbering gallop with all 4 feet in the air at the same time and the tail held straight up in the air, the last 4 inches or so curling over. This not being adapted for long distances, Tippitty would soon overshoot her endurance and come to a halt. If I were near, she would make for my leg and be up on my shoulder in the twinkling of an eye. Or if Brock or Dawn happened to be at hand, she would spring onto one of their backs and get a free ride. An oak or a deodar tree invariably attracted her attention, and she would make her way to the extreme end of a branch and nibble off the young leaves. The point of the stem, which grew out of the branch, appealed to her most, and she would pick off leaf after leaf, just nibbling the juicy end of it and throwing the rest away. However, she was quite happy on any tree or shrub and found something to eat on all. As I have already said, Tippitty was nocturnal and woke up a little after sunset if left to herself. Provided she did not get a good dinner, she would be prepared to play and look about for odds and ends to nibble on all night through. I very soon discovered that a good feed just before I went to bed had the effect of making her sleepy too. On custard nights, Tippitty would invariably overeat, and that meant sleeping solidly till the early hours of the morning. She very seldom woke me during the night. As a rule, I would wake up to find a warm, soft, furry ball curled up against my neck. But occasionally the awakening would be much ruder and I would find Tippitty having a lovely game with my toes, my ears or my hair. There was something extraordinarily fascinating about her every movement, and her little chirrup of pleasure was very sweet to hear. Tippitty had an assortment of calls. Her growl was most alarming and would have done credit to an animal 10 times her size. She had a temper of her own, I'm sorry to say, which every member of the household, master and dogs included, had occasion to remember. It showed for a second and was gone again as suddenly as it had been roused. But in that instant, her sharp claws had torn some offending hand, or her terrible teeth had sent a dog howling out of the room. Poor Tippitty, her end was tragic in the extreme. We hope it was also painless. She had been tied up just before dinner, but somehow the end of the chain had got unfastened from the leg of the chair. I heard her hopping about on the boards of the veranda and dragging her chain behind her. I went out to bring her back, but in that instant something flashed past me. There was a tiny squeal, and a fox had poor Tippitty in its relentless jaws. Her death was avenged, but that is another story.